Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Ashford called her when she arrived at Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk, as though the title itself was something soft, something replaceable. He didn't know she'd spent 16 years making life-or-death decisions in places where the ground still smelled like copper and diesel. He didn't know that her hands, those careful, steady hands restocking suture trays under the fluorescent lights, had held soldiers together on operating tables that weren't tables at all. He didn't know that the faded unit patch sewn carefully inside the lining of her jacket, hidden against her heart in the depths of her locker, represented operations that officially never happened. Katie Rodriguez moved through Oak Creek Memorial like she was trying to disappear into the walls themselves. The first month was about invisibility. It was about keeping her head down, answering questions with deflection, offering her name and nothing else. Where had she worked before? Overseas? Mobile clinics? Trauma contract work? Why did she never talk about her past? She preferred to focus on the present. The other nurses at the unit desk tried at first, warm gestures, coffee invitations, questions about family, but Katie had developed a particular kind of kindness that made it impossible to get close. She redirected every conversation back to the patient, back to the shift, back to the work. By week 3, they'd stopped asking. By week 4, they'd accepted her presence the way you accept weather. She was just there. But on the morning of her 28th day at Oak Creek Memorial, something shifted. The overhead intercom crackled to life. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. No announcement, just urgency and the collective muscle memory of crisis. Katie was in the medication dispensary when the call came, and her hands moved before her mind caught up. She was already moving, already calculating, already reading the code because her body understood the language of collapse in a way that most nurses' bodies never would. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects as she pushed through the trauma bay doors and found the patient, Commander James Hewitt, a Navy SEAL recovering from blast injury sustained in Sanjin, now seizing, oxygen saturation dropping with each convulsion. The room was controlled chaos. The resident was calling out vitals, the ER attending was already reaching for medications, and the monitor showed the kind of rhythm that made even experienced nurses move faster. Katie assessed the scene in the way people assess threats. Patient age, roughly 42. Known cardiac history? No. Contraindications? She was running through the mental checklist while the others were running through protocols. The attending shouted for sedation. A 14-gauge angiocath needle went in. The resident's hands reached for the medication card with the automatic confidence of someone who had never been wrong before, or at least had never been corrected. Katie stood 3 feet from the medication cart, watching. Watching was what she did best. Watching was how you survived. Watching was how you noticed the small things that killed people, the subtle signs that everyone else missed because they were too busy performing their roles. The attending wanted propofol. Standard. The thing most hospitals reached for when they needed sedation. But Commander Hewitt was already on lorazepam. She could see the note right there in the chart, half visible on the monitor. She could see it as clearly as if it were written in blood. Propofol plus benzos at his current dose would drop his blood pressure to a place it didn't come back from. The interaction was textbook dangerous, the kind of thing that lived in the section of pharmacology that people read during their certification classes and then forgot because it seemed too obvious, too preventable. The attending's hand reached toward the medication drawer. It was a small movement, nothing that would have caught anyone's attention except that Katie was already moving. She didn't run. She didn't call out. She simply moved from where she was standing to where she needed to be, her hand gentle but absolute as it intercepted his wrist. Not a push. Not aggressive. Just a stop. The kind of stop that military personnel recognized immediately because it came from someone accustomed to being obeyed. The attending froze. The resident stopped mid-vital. The room held its breath. Propofol with his current benzos could arrest him, doctor. Katie's voice was level, clinical, the kind of voice that delivered information without opinion. Perhaps dexmedetomidine instead? It's safer with his medication profile. We need the sedation without the cardiac risk. She released his wrist. Her hands dropped back to her sides. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften it with a question mark at the end or a smile to make it palatable. She simply stated the fact and stepped back, as though she'd merely pointed out that a monitor lead had disconnected. The attending's face went through several colors. Red was one of them. The resident looked at Katie, then at the attending, then back at Katie. There was something in that moment, some shift in the air pressure of the room, that made it clear that the hierarchy everyone assumed was true had just revealed cracks. Because Katie Rodriguez didn't move like someone who was supposed to defer to doctors. She moved like someone who had made these decisions alone, in rooms where there was no attending, where the only authority was the blood on her hands and the life or death outcome hanging in the balance. The attending reached for the dexmedetomidine. The medication went in. The seizure stopped. The oxygen saturation climbed. 92, 95. 97, sinus rhythm. Clean, steady, alive. Nobody thanked her. Nobody said anything at all. But that was the moment Dr. Marcus Ashford started watching her in a different way. He'd seen the code. He'd been making rounds on the floor above when the call came down, and something, curiosity, maybe, or the particular kind of predatory instinct that some administrators developed when they sensed a threat, had drawn him down to watch. He'd stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand, observing the way the attending deferred to the resident, the way the resident deferred to the nurses, the way the nurses actually moved. That was when he saw it. The moment when a woman in a standard-issue hospital badge and unremarkable scrubs had simply redirected the decision-making power in the room with nothing but a hand on a wrist and a calm sentence. The moment when senior nurses who had worked at Oak Creek Memorial for longer than most residents spent in their training, turned slightly when she moved past them, their attention tracking her like a compass needle finding north. The moment when her clinical assessment overrode the attending's instinct without resistance. Dr. Ashford was not a man who tolerated hierarchies he didn't control. The East Wing nursing unit was his territory. He'd spent 17 years building a careful structure where his authority was absolute, where every decision flowed through him, where nurses understood that their role was to execute, not to think. The way some of the older nurses looked at Katie when they thought he wasn't watching, with respect, with deference, made his jaw clench. There was something in that first month that he couldn't quite place, some absence in her credentials that should have been simple to exploit. But her hands during that code had moved with the precision of someone who had performed this exact procedure on actual battlefields. Her assessment had been faster than his own would have been. Her suggestion had been not a question but a statement of fact dressed up in the language of courtesy. 2 days later, Dr. Ashford accessed Katie's personnel file at 2:06 a.m. from his office computer. Her work history showed overseas contract positions. Her references were military. Her credentials were legitimate but unremarkable, nothing that explained the way senior nurses straightened when she passed, nothing that justified the quiet authority that seemed to surround her like a force field. Nothing that gave him the ammunition he needed. But he was a patient man. He'd built his power carefully over 17 years. He could wait. He could watch. And when the moment came to move against her, and he was certain now that a moment would come, he would be ready. The next morning, Katie was in the medication dispensary again, organizing the inventory with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. Her hands moved through familiar patterns. Check dates. Verify counts. Ensure nothing was expired, nothing was mislabeled, nothing was unsafe. This was the work that kept people alive. This was the work that nobody thanked you for until something went wrong. Behind her, at the unit desk, she could hear the other nurses talking in the way they talked when they thought she couldn't hear them, cautious, aware, as if they were in the presence of something they didn't quite understand. One of them was telling a story about a shift where a patient had coded, and the way the story was told, you could tell they'd already rewritten it in their heads to make the attending sound braver and smarter than he'd actually been. That was how hospitals worked. That was how power worked. The people who actually saved lives got forgotten. The people with the titles got the stories. Katie understood this completely. She'd lived in that world long enough to know that invisibility was a kind of protection. If nobody knew who you really were, nobody could use it against you. If you kept your head down and did the work and never asked for credit, then when the politics started, and in hospitals, the politics always started, you had nothing to lose because you'd never claimed anything to begin with. What she didn't know was that keeping your head down only works when nobody is paying attention. And Dr. Marcus Ashford was paying very close attention now. Dr. Ashford entered Commander Hewitt's room at 9:33 a.m., when the light from the window fell in exact geometric rectangles across the tile floor. Katie was adjusting the blood pressure cuff around the commander's arm. His 13-year-old daughter, Emma, stood beside him holding a bouquet of yellow sunflowers, and his mother, a woman with silver hair pulled tight as a drum, sat rigid in the visitor's chair. This was family rounds. This was supposed to be safe. Katie didn't look up when Ashford arrived. She'd learned that lesson in week 2. "Commander Hewitt," Ashford said, his voice carrying the particular brightness of a man about to perform. "I wanted to check in personally on your progress. Though I have some concerns about the quality of care you've been receiving." Emma's eyes narrowed slightly. She was smart, this kid. Too smart. "Your nurse here," Ashford gestured toward Katie without looking at her, the way you might gesture at furniture, "made some rather aggressive suggestions yesterday regarding your medication protocol. Perhaps you'd like to explain to your family, Nurse Rodriguez, exactly why you think your limited credentials qualify you to override physician orders." Katie's hands remained steady on the blood pressure cuff. The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Then, I suggested an alternative protocol for patient safety, Doctor. That's the problem with you basic bedside types." Ashford moved closer, his shoes clicking against the tile with each step. The sound was deliberate, territorial. "You forget your place. Stick to vitals and linen changes, sweetheart. Leave medicine to the actual doctors." The word sweetheart hung in the air like sour milk. Emma's jaw clenched. Her mother, the commander's ex-wife, Katie had learned from a chart note, would have looked away. But Emma didn't. Emma watched Katie's face the way a hawk watches a field. Katie took one measured breath. Her fingers remained steady on the cuff, reading the pressure without tremor, without hesitation. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. "The contraindicated combination you ordered would have caused respiratory depression and cardiovascular collapse in a patient with his cardiac history, Doctor." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next bed breathing for its unconscious occupant. "That's insubordination," Ashford said flatly. "And frankly, it's above your pay grade." Katie released the blood pressure cuff and straightened. Her dark eyes met Ashford's without breaking contact. A single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from fear, not from shame, but from the sheer compression of restraint, of holding something vast and terrible behind the fragile cage of professional courtesy. She wiped it away with 2 fingers, still holding his gaze. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Doctor." Ashford's face flushed burgundy. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Men like Ashford built entire careers on the assumption that people like Katie would always, eventually, crumble. He smirked, a reflexive thing, armor against the moment that had just slipped out of his control, and walked out of the room without another word. His shoes clicked against the tile again, retreating now. Emma watched him go. Then she looked at Katie and said quietly, "Thank you for taking care of my dad." Katie nodded once. By 11:11 a.m., the break room felt like a tomb. Katie pushed open the double doors with her hip, coffee mug in hand, a chipped ceramic thing with a faded logo from some defunct hospital in San Diego. 5 senior nurses sat around the table: Maria, who'd trained her on the first day, Christine, who'd shown her where the bathroom was, Tom, who never made eye contact but always left extra supplies at her station, and 2 others whose names Katie still had to consciously retrieve from memory. When Katie approached, Maria's eyes shifted left. Christine looked at her hands. Tom stood first, pushing his chair back without a sound. The others followed in the awkward shuffle of people abandoning a sinking ship. "Sorry," Maria mouthed, but she was already moving, already following the others out the door. Her half-eaten sandwich stayed behind on the plastic plate, lettuce beginning to brown at the edges. Katie sat down at the table. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head, a sound like electricity learning to speak. She raised the coffee mug to her lips and found it had gone cold. That was all right. Cold coffee tasted the same as hot coffee if you didn't think about the difference. An hour later, she passed the public unit board in the hallway, the one where shift assignments and infection prevention announcements were posted. A new document had been added, printed in that particular font that meant official business, the kind of typeface designed to carry the weight of institutional authority. The handwriting beneath the printed text was Ashford's, sharp, controlled, the signature of someone who'd learned that documentation was a weapon you could fire without leaving fingerprints. Staff averted their eyes as they passed. A young resident Katie didn't know glanced at the board, then at Katie, then looked away. That was worse than walking out of the break room. That was the moment everyone understood, she was toxic. Proximity was dangerous. At 4:15 p.m., Maria found her in the supply closet, not hiding, just restocking the trauma kits, her hands moving through the mechanical choreography of inventory. Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's connected to the board," Maria said. "His brother-in-law sits on the credentialing committee. Ashford made a call, and last month they fired another nurse. She'd worked here for 8 years, for way less than what you did. Nobody crosses him and survives here." Katie registered this the way you register weather. Useful information. Tactically relevant. But it didn't change anything. The board was already activated. The machinery was already turning. In her experience, once you became a problem that someone like Ashford needed to solve, the solution was rarely about justice or logic. It was about power. It was about proving that he had it and you didn't. Maria left the supply closet. Katie finished counting the gauze pads, 17, should be 20, and made a note on the clipboard. By tomorrow, Ashford would probably have her moved to nights. That was the next phase. Isolation. Night shift was where careers went to die, 3 months of graveyard nursing and then the quiet conversation with HR where they made the termination sound mutual. She was folding the trauma kit back into its designated spot, her fingers precise and efficient, when the first explosion hit. The building shuddered like an animal startled from sleep. The fluorescent lights above flickered, steadied, then died. Emergency power kicked in with a low hum, painting everything in the sickly amber of backup lighting. Katie's body moved before her conscious mind caught up, 8 years of training, muscle memory that transcended everything else, every cover and every pretense, all of it suddenly, completely irrelevant. The code blue alarm sounded from somewhere on the east wing. Then another. Then the PA system crackled to life with the voice of an administrator, "All staff implement lockdown protocol. Remain calm." Katie was already moving toward the sound, not away. Away was what civilians did. Away was not in her programming. Commander Hewitt's room was on the east wing, 3rd floor, corner position. She made it there in under 90 seconds, navigating hallways where plaster dust hung in the air like morning fog and patients in wheelchairs blocked the corridors, screaming. The window to his room had exploded inward. Glass lay across the linoleum like diamonds scattered by an angry hand. The commander was trying to sit up, his surgical drain still in place, lines running from his abdomen into collection bottles, thin tubes that shouldn't be moved, shouldn't be stressed. His face was pale but conscious, aware. He was a warrior, and warriors understood what explosions meant. Through the shattered remains of the window, Katie saw the second mortar arc through the sky, a black line against the blue, falling like a god's judgment. 3 seconds. Maybe less. Physics was very clear about what 3 seconds meant. She moved. Her body crossed the distance to his bed in a motion that was more animal than human. She threw herself across the commander's torso, protecting his surgical sites, protecting the damage that hadn't fully healed, and pressed her back toward the window. Toward the shrapnel that was coming. The blast wave hit like a truck doing 90. The sound was a physical thing, a force that separated molecules, that rewrote the air pressure in the room. Shrapnel came through like a horizontal hailstorm, hot metal, fragments of window frame, the calcium debris of the building itself, all of it moving at speeds that killed before the body understood it was dying. Katie felt the shrapnel tear across her back and left shoulder. Hot metal threaded through her scrubs, peeled skin from her shoulder blade, left trails of fire across her ribs. Her own blood painted the floor in arterial red. The commander screamed, not in pain, but in fury, understanding that she'd just saved his life by putting her own between the blast and his healing wounds. Emma's scream came from the doorway. She'd been bringing flowers. Fresh sunflowers. They lay scattered across the tile now, yellow petals and shrapnel indistinguishable from each other. Katie didn't scream. Through the ringing in her ears, a high-pitched tone that felt like it was coming from inside her own skull, she heard coding monitors from the hallway. Multiple alarms. Multiple deaths happening in real time, every second that passed costing lives. Her own blood pooled beneath her. She could feel it, warm and strange, the peculiar heat of bodily fluid leaving the body where it was meant to stay. But pain was information. Pain was data. And the data was clear, she could still move, still function, still think. She crawled off the commander's bed. Shrapnel glinted in the emergency lighting, still embedded in her left shoulder blade. She could feel the weight of it, the foreign object her body recognized as an intruder. She reached for the trauma kit mounted on the wall beside the bed. A resident stumbled into the room, his face the color of ash. Chest wound. She could see the sucking chest wound from 3 meters away, the way the skin opened and closed with each breath, the way air was moving through the breach instead of down the trachea. Tension pneumothorax. The resident's oxygen saturation was probably 40% by now. Maybe less. Katie's hands moved on their own. She was already at the crash cart, her fingers finding what she needed, a scalpel, a 14-gauge needle, a moment of clarity so sharp it cut through everything else. The resident collapsed into the available space, not on a bed, on the floor, on the tile painted with her own blood and his and the debris of violence. Her hands didn't shake as she located the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the anatomical window where a needle could decompress the trapped air and buy him 3 minutes of consciousness before the proper decompression could happen. She'd done this in Sanjin when the morphine was gone and the helicopters were still 20 minutes out. She'd done this in places where the power never flickered because there was no power, where the only light was burning vehicles and the only sound was men dying. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Above her, she heard Dr. Ashford's voice crackling over the PA from the administrative wing, all staff implement lockdown protocol. She was 3 corridors away from Ashford, and she was saving lives. He was behind a locked door, calling in directives that nobody could implement because they were dying, because the building was coming apart, because the only person with the skills and the training and the absolute refusal to break was bleeding on the floor, her surgical mask now painted red, her hand steady as a surgical laser. The medication cart moved like clockwork through Oak Creek Memorial's 4th floor. Katie checked the 4 line on Commander Hewitt's morphine drip, noted the numbers on his chart, blood pressure 128/80, heart rate steady at 72, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, and was turning toward the door when the first explosion hit. Not the sound. The feeling. A percussion wave that traveled through the building like a heartbeat gone wrong, a bass note that made the floor shift and the ceiling tiles rattle. The commander's eyes went wide. Katie's hand found the bed rail, steadying herself against a shock that most of her body had already processed, a boom that came from somewhere east, from where the corridors bent toward the parking lot wing. Then the sound caught up. The second explosion was bigger. The windows along the east corridor didn't shatter so much as disintegrate, glass turning to spray, to glitter, to lethal confetti. The force of it rolled through the ward like a physical thing, a wall of pressure that knocked the medication cart sideways. Katie heard the glass singing, that high crystalline note of catastrophe, and heard the first screams, distant and raw, muffled by distance and shock. Commander Hewitt tried to sit up. Tubes pulled taut. "Stay down," Katie said. Not a suggestion. She moved toward the window to assess. The parking lot was coming into view, no, not the lot. Fire. The east wing had taken the full impact of whatever had come in from the direction of Naval Station Norfolk. Smoke rolled in black columns. The morning light had turned orange and wrong. The third explosion she felt through her boots. This one was close. Close enough that the hallway shook, close enough that the interior corridor window, the one that looked out onto the nurse station, went from transparent to absent in the space of half a breath. Katie was already moving. She wasn't thinking about Dr. Ashford or the write-up or the 12 hours of hell she'd endured over the past 2 weeks. Muscle memory took over. Battlefield instinct. 12 years compressed into muscle and reflex. She crossed the 3 strides between the window and the bed and put her body over Commander Hewitt's like a shield, her arms braced on either side of him, her back to the incoming fire. The shrapnel came through like teeth. She felt the first impact at her shoulder blade, a punch that didn't hurt, not yet, just a sudden intrusion of something hot and foreign. The second hit came across her lower back, and the third, and the sensation was like being clawed from the outside, glass and metal and something that used to be a window frame now painting her scrubs in red. The blood came fast. She could smell it, that copper iron smell that meant serious, that meant arteries, that meant the next few minutes would be about triage and survival and nothing else. Katie didn't move. Not until the sound of shattering stopped. Not until the wave of pressure passed. Then she straightened, assessed. Commander Hewitt was intact, eyes locked on hers with a recognition she didn't have time to process, and turned toward the door. The ward had become a controlled nightmare. Mrs. Chen from room 42 was on the floor bleeding from her forehead. The intern from phlebotomy was trapped under a medication cart. 2 patients were trying to crawl toward the stairwell while their 4s were still running. The monitors were screaming in chorus, a symphony of code conditions and falling oxygen SATs and hearts in distress. Katie moved through it all without looking at her own blood. That was information for later. Right now, her body was running a program written in combat medicine, in 12-hour shifts in field hospitals in Sanjin where triage meant deciding who you had 5 minutes for and who you had to let go. She knelt beside Mrs. Chen, assessed the head wound, scalp laceration, significant bleeding but the bone was intact, and pressed a 2x2 gauze against it. Pressure. Keep your head tilted forward. You're going to be fine. The voice she was using wasn't the one Dr. Ashford had heard all week. This voice came from somewhere deeper, from operational centers, from the part of her that had coordinated casualty evacuation under fire. To the intern, can you move your legs? I think so. Get to triage. Bay 3. Tell them you're priority 2 and you need Dr. Whitmore. Go. The intern went. Katie was already moving to the next patient, and the next, calling out assessments like someone who'd been doing this for more than 2 years, more than 22 months of nursing school. Pressure dressing on that arm. Loosen that 4. Get him water. No, wait, nothing by mouth, he might need surgery. Move your bed away from the window. Her own breath came steady. Her hands didn't shake. The blood soaking through her scrubs was someone else's problem. Right now there were 8 critical patients and 1 nurse and a building that was still coming apart at the seams. The doors to the stairwell burst open. 3 paramedics came through, faces dust white, eyes searching for leadership. Katie straightened. She was still bleeding. The paramedic in front, name tag read Gomez, saw her and his eyes went to her wounds, to the shredded fabric, to the amount of red that didn't match the calm in her voice. You need treatment, Gomez said. Tension pneumo, left side, needle now. Katie was pointing at the patient 2 beds down, a construction worker with a crush injury who was turning grey. 14-gauge angiocath. Decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Move. Gomez moved. Because he'd heard the tone. Because something in the way she delivered that instruction said she'd done this before, done it in places where people died when you hesitated, in places where the difference between a living patient and a corpse was 6 seconds and absolute certainty. Commander Hewitt was still awake, still watching her. His 4 was running clear saline. His monitors showed the steady rhythm of someone who understood that the person moving through his ward wasn't the nurse who'd brought him water yesterday. This was something else. Something older. Katie finished her sweep of the immediate ward and moved to the trauma bay where the real crisis was waiting. A resident, Dr. Patterson, fresh out of medical school, maybe 30 years old, was coding on a gurney. Chest wound, entrance and exit, the kind that meant lungs, meant maybe heart. The monitor showed a chaotic rhythm, VFib, the heart beating itself to death. The defibrillator pads were already on. The shock went through. No change. How long? Katie asked. For minutes. Maybe 5. He came in walking. The trauma attending was panicking, hands moving but without direction. This was the difference between knowing CPR and knowing what to do when it mattered. Katie didn't answer. She was looking at the setup, the crash cart, the field kit, the scalpel someone had dropped and not picked up yet. She reached down. Her hands came up with the scalpel, already moving, already cutting through the ribs with the precision of someone who'd done field thoracotomies in dust and darkness and worse. The muscle memory was faster than thought. 10 millimeters at the 5th intercostal space. The internal mammary retractor she'd have used in Sanjin wasn't here, so she used her fingers and will, spreading the ribs, accessing the pericardium. The room had gone absolutely silent. She found the wound. One hand on the heart, she could feel it, that muscle that was barely trying anymore, that had 3 minutes of oxygen left if she was lucky. She pinched off the bleeding with her fingers and looked at the attending. Epinephrine. 1 milligram, 4, now. The attending injected. She massaged the heart with the rhythm of a metronome, not frantic, not desperate, just the calm compression of someone who'd held organs in her hands before and kept them moving through sheer force of will. The monitor still showed VFib. Still showed chaos. Again, she said. The epi went in. She kept compressing. Her back screamed, the shrapnel wounds pulling with every movement, and she didn't acknowledge it because pain was information and information could wait. She was a circuit, a machine, a program running on 12 years of training that had no name on any resume because it had been classified, because it had happened in places that officially didn't exist. The monitor changed. Sinus rhythm. Weak but present. The heart, her heart, the heart she was holding in her hands, started remembering how to beat. Katie eased her grip. The attending moved in with sterile gauze and she stepped back, her hand slick with blood that wasn't entirely hers. The resident was still critical, still probably not going to make it through the next hour, but he had an hour now. He had a chance. The military police arrived at 9:17 a.m. Katie knew the time because she'd checked the wall clock after securing the last of the critical patients, after delegating triage to the staff who'd unfrozen enough to take direction. The MPs came through the stairwell in formation, riot gear and protocol, checking every room, every corridor. They were looking for something, a device, a person, evidence of coordination. What they found was a nurse in scrubs that looked like a war crime, her back and shoulder wrapped in field dressings that she'd applied herself while talking another resident through stabilizing a femur fracture. One of the MPs, a captain, bars on her collar, approached. "We need to interview everyone who was on this floor. Medical personnel included." Katie nodded. She was turning toward the conversation space when the overhead paged, not a code, not a crackle. A voice, flat and administrative, security to 4th floor nurse station. Code yellow. Disciplinary escort required. The captain looked up. Katie didn't. She already knew who'd called. She already knew the narrative had started spinning the moment the second explosion hit, because that was the kind of man Dr. Ashford was. The kind who could hear mortars and think about board positions. "I need to get Captain Rodriguez's statement," the MP said. But Katie was already being approached by security, 2 men in polo shirts and poor decisions, and behind them, Katie didn't have to turn to see it, was Dr. Ashford, emerging from his administrative tower, his phone still in his hand. This employee is being placed on immediate investigative suspension pending disciplinary review, Ashford said to the MP. Hospital policy requires we separate her from the premises during all critical incidents. Security concern. Erratic behavior during the emergency. Katie could have disputed it. She could have opened her mouth and explained exactly what had happened in the past 12 minutes, could have let the captain see the results of her work, patient stabilized, critical care delivered, lives extended. She could have shown her the shrapnel wound because that would have contradicted the narrative of erratic behavior quite effectively. Instead, she took one measured breath and let them walk her toward the exit. The blood on her scrubs was still wet. Dr. Ashford's fingers moved across his office phone with the precision of a man executing a controlled demolition. Conference call. Board members on speed dial. His voice carried the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 20 years building alliances that could survive almost anything, almost. Gentlemen, I need to walk you through what happened in trauma this morning, he began, his tone measured, reasonable, the voice of a doctor protecting his institution from liability. We had a critical incident. One of our nursing staff, newer hire, limited credentials, overstepped her scope during the mortar strike chaos. Performed a thoracotomy without authorization. Unsupervised. We're looking at serious liability exposure. The board members listened. They always did. Ashford had donated to their children's private schools. He'd attended their country club dinners. He understood the delicate architecture of power in small cities. You didn't dismantle it with force. You restructured it quietly, one phone call at a time. I'm filing termination paperwork as we speak, he continued. Multiple violations. But I want to be transparent about the bigger issue. Her presence here is creating an unsafe environment. She's unstable. Erratic. During the code this morning, she was practically manic. We need her gone before she does real damage. By 11:22 a.m., the decision was made. Not discussed. Not debated. Made. The board would support termination. The liability was his to manage. Katie Rodriguez would be gone by end of shift. Ashford hung up and allowed himself a thin smile. Then he turned his attention to containment. The nurses who'd watched Katie work during the crisis, the ones who'd seen her hands move with surgical precision, who'd heard her call out orders that saved a resident's life while she bled through her own scrubs, those nurses needed to understand that witnessing nothing was safer than witnessing truth. Ashford made for personnel transfers that morning. 2 to the night shift. 1 to pediatrics on the opposite end of the hospital. 1 to a floating pool that worked 3 different facilities across Norfolk. Each transfer was buried in routine staffing paperwork. Each nurse received a quiet phone call from HR suggesting that these new assignments were opportunities. Growth opportunities. Better schedules. The alternative, staying on the same unit, might create complications with certain physicians. The message was clear without being stated outright. By noon, the only person who'd watched Katie save a life was either gone or learning to look away. The termination paperwork was a masterpiece of administrative weaponization. Ashford had 17 violations typed out, each one technically defensible, each one deliberately constructed to make her look reckless rather than skilled. Unauthorized administration of emergency procedures during code. Operating outside scope of practice despite explicit restrictions placed by attending physician. Unsupervised surgical intervention on hospital premises. Creating unsafe conditions through insubordination and erratic decision-making. The language was bureaucratic and airtight. By the time anyone read it, the narrative was already set, not a hero, but a liability. Not a savior, but a loose cannon. He printed 2 copies and walked them personally to human resources, his jaw tight with the satisfaction of a man who'd outmaneuvered a threat before it could even fully materialize. Katie Rodriguez would leave this hospital with a termination for cause, a damaged professional reputation, and no platform to tell her version of events. Hospitals protected their own. They protected doctors. They buried nurses. That was how the system worked. That was how it had always worked. But Ashford didn't know that Katie Rodriguez had a version of the system that he'd never encountered before. At 2:15 p.m., 2 naval police officers appeared in the ER, asking questions about the mortar strike, about the hospital's response, about the woman who'd been treating the SEAL commander. Ashford intercepted them before they reached Trauma Bay, his tone apologetic and professional. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "The staff member you're asking about, she's no longer under my supervision. In fact, she's being terminated for policy violations related to the incident. I've documented several concerning behavioral patterns during the crisis. Erratic decision-making. Unauthorized procedures. I wouldn't recommend conducting an official interview until our legal team has reviewed the liability questions." The senior naval police officer, Petty Officer First Class Mercer, with the bearing of someone who'd seen through bureaucratic bullshit for 20 years, started to object. But Ashford had already called security. 2 hospital officers appeared, flanking the corridor with the polite inevitability of institutional machinery. "I'm sure you understand," Ashford continued, "we have protocols. The staff member in question is being escorted from the premises. Any statement she might make would be documented as coming from a disgruntled employee with a clear motive to fabricate incidents. Our legal team recommends against formal interviews until we've completed our internal review." Mercer's jaw clenched. But he was Navy, and he understood chains of command, and Ashford was right about one thing: a statement from a fired nurse would be weaponized in court. He gestured to his partner. They'd come back. They had other ways. But not today. Katie was at her locker when security found her, still in her scrubs, blood dried dark across the shoulder seams. The bandages beneath were showing through. She'd tried to change, but the movement reopened the wounds, so she'd given up, just pulled a clean shirt over the bloody one, the fabric clinging to the gauze in a way that made her movement stiff and careful. "You need to leave the premises," the security officer said, not unkindly. "Hospital policy. You've been terminated." Katie nodded. She'd been expecting this. She picked up her cardboard box, the one with her jacket, her ID badge, the personal items that had accumulated during her first month at Oak Creek Memorial, and followed him toward the exit. She didn't argue. She didn't question. She moved the way she always moved, measured, controlled, giving nothing away. The security officer walked her to the parking lot, where the late afternoon sun was already starting its descent, and the weight of what had happened began to settle across her shoulders like a second injury. That evening, Katie sat alone in the hospital's laundry room on the basement level, the one place she still had access to retrieve her things. The walls were lined with industrial washers, their metal doors reflecting fluorescent light that hummed with a frequency that made her teeth ache. The room smelled like bleach and detergent, sharp, chemical, cutting. Her blood-stained scrubs lay on the folding table in front of her. She picked up the first one, the blue shirt she'd worn during morning rounds before the attack, before shrapnel had torn through the east wing, before everything had changed. The sleeves were stiff with her own blood. She folded it anyway, military corners, precision work, the muscle memory of 1,000 uniform inspections moving through her hands without conscious thought. Fold. Crease. Fold again. Each movement sent small jolts of pain across her back and shoulder. The shrapnel wounds were only barely bandaged. A sympathetic ER nurse, someone young and scared of Ashford, had snuck her trauma gauze and antiseptic spray, but there wasn't time for proper treatment. Katie had cleaned the wounds as best she could in a bathroom stall, her reflection in the mirror looking back at her with that same calm detachment she'd learned to cultivate across 2 decades of service. She didn't look like someone who'd just been fired. She looked like someone who'd seen worse and was still standing. The termination papers sat on the folding table beside her scrubs. 17 violations. Unauthorized procedures. Scope of practice violations. Erratic behavior. Each line was a carefully constructed lie built on a foundation of truth. Yes, she'd performed a thoracotomy. Yes, it was unauthorized. Yes, she'd acted on instinct rather than protocol. All of it was true. All of it was also the reason a resident was alive instead of flatlined. Katie picked up the second pair of scrubs, the one she'd been wearing when the mortar struck, when she'd thrown herself across Commander Hewitt's bed, when the window had exploded inward and shrapnel had painted the floor red. The fabric was soaked dark, the stain still tacky with dried blood. She folded it anyway, each crease deliberate, controlled, refusing to give way to the trembling that wanted to move through her hands. A janitor entered the laundry room and immediately saw her sitting there, surrounded by bloody scrubs and termination papers, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, the kind of quiet that comes from someone who's learned that noise is a luxury she can't afford. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, noted the blood on her scrubs, the bandages visible beneath her shirt collar, the official-looking papers on the folding table, and quietly left without saying anything. Katie didn't watch him go. She kept folding, kept working, kept moving through the muscle memory of departure. This was what it looked like when a career ended. Not with ceremony. Not with explanation. Just a laundry room, industrial fluorescent light, and a woman folding evidence of her own undoing. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 floors above her, in a locked conference room on the hospital's administrative wing, 2 naval intelligence officers reviewed a file that had been flagged 6 hours earlier. The file was buried so deep in classified archives that its very existence was compartmentalized, but the biometric scan from the Naval Police database, the one that had flagged Katie's presence at an active attack site, had triggered an automated protocol that hadn't been activated in 18 months. The file was labeled Valkyrie Administrative Death Protocol, Active. Inside were photographs. Katie in dress uniform, standing at attention. Katie receiving medals. Katie in tactical gear, covered in dust from Sanjin, her eyes carrying the weight of operations that were still classified, still deniable, still erased from any official record. The paperwork was sparse by design, compartmentalized and meant information was need-to-know only, and most of the file's contents had been redacted even from senior staff. But the order was clear. Katie Rodriguez had been ordered into deep cover 18 months ago after a Black Ops mission in Sanjin had gone catastrophically wrong. A disaster. A betrayal. Something so significant that the Navy decided the only way to protect her was to erase her completely. Scrub her records. Give her a civilian identity. Tell her never to surface, never to use her name, never to acknowledge the operations that had shaped her career. The protection protocol had been absolute. Until yesterday, when she'd thrown herself across a SEAL commander to shield him from shrapnel, when her muscle memory had taken over, when her hands had moved with surgical precision that no baseline civilian nurse could possibly possess. Until she'd surfaced. The 2 officers, Captain Sarah Mitchell from Naval Intelligence and a commander named Graves who'd worked with Katie in Sanjin and knew exactly what she was capable of, looked at each other across the conference table. "The protection order is compromised," Mitchell said quietly. "She's been identified. The SEAL team knows. The hospital is going to crucify her for it." Graves nodded. His jaw was tight. He'd served with Katie. He knew what she'd sacrificed to disappear. "Then we terminate the protection protocol," he said. "She surfaces officially. Full identity reinstatement. The Navy confirms what she did. We control the narrative before Ashford's lawyers turn this into a he said she said." Mitchell made a phone call. For minutes later, she hung up. "Orders are confirmed," she said. "Full reinstatement. Effective immediately. The SEAL team commander, Hewitt, he's going to speak." His daughter was there. His entire family saw what happened. The Navy supporting the reveal. Graves looked at the photograph of Katie in tactical gear, taken in Sanjin 17 years ago, young and fierce and absolutely certain that she'd carry her unit home. He'd seen her carry 3 wounded Marines across 2 kilometers of Taliban-held territory while taking fire. He'd seen her stabilize a compound fracture with nothing but field supplies and pure will. He'd seen her do impossible things and walk away like it was just Tuesday. "What time?" Graves asked. 0600 hours, Mitchell said. "Main corridor. Full dress uniform unit. The commander will make the announcement. The hospital staff will know exactly what they're dealing with." Graves stood. He looked at the file one more time, at the woman who'd been officially dead for 18 months, at the impossible choice she'd made to stay buried rather than risk her unit's security. And then he made a decision that would change everything. At 0600 hours the next morning, Major Katie Rodriguez didn't know that her entire life was about to be reclaimed. She didn't know that naval intelligence had already moved. That the protection protocol had been terminated. That the Navy had decided to claim her, acknowledge her, stand behind every classified operation she'd conducted in the dark. She was going to find out in approximately 4 minutes. And it was going to change everything. The next morning, Oak Creek Memorial fell silent in a way that silence shouldn't be able to fall. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else entirely, something that made the air pressure change, made the fluorescent light seem suddenly dimmer. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. A column of Navy SEALs in dress uniforms moved through the main corridor like a formation of apex predators, their movements synchronized, their presence reshaping the space around them. 14 men. Dress blues with gold insignia. The kind of uniforms that don't walk into hospitals. The kind that change everything when they do. Dr. Marcus Ashford stood at the far end of the hallway, his mouth opening and closing like a fish searching for water that wasn't there. He'd been preparing his next move, already drafting the letter that would explain away the mortar attack as operational chaos, already constructing the narrative that positioned him as the victim of a nurse's incompetence rather than the architect of her destruction. The column stopped him cold. They parted, and through the gap walked Commander James Hewitt. He moved on legs that shouldn't have been able to support him, moving against every piece of medical advice Katie had given him not 6 hours earlier when she was being escorted out by security. He pushed away the orderly reaching for his wheelchair. He didn't need it. Not now. His eyes found Katie standing by the exit with her termination papers still in her trembling hands, and no, the trembling wasn't fear, it was the aftershock of injustice, the muscle tension of someone forced to stand still while the world burned around her. Commander Hewitt looked directly at her. 14 SEALs behind him. 14 men who'd trained under her name, who'd survived operations because of her decisions, who carried her voice in their heads like a tactical frequency always open. One word came out of his mouth, and it carried the weight of classified operations, of black sites and scrubbed records, of identities officially erased for operational security. One word that made every staff member within earshot understand they'd been standing next to a legend the entire time. Valkyrie. The room didn't just go quiet. The room forgot how to breathe. A hospital administrator appeared, flanking Hewitt, her tablet trembling slightly. Behind her came a SEAL team leader with a chest that seemed to hold every medal the military possessed, his ribbon stacked like evidence of a life spent in places that didn't officially exist. Hewitt's 13-year-old daughter stepped forward from the group, her uniform crisp, her eyes locked on Katie with the kind of intensity that only came from knowing exactly what her father's scars meant. "Thank you, Major." That was all she said. 3 words. Her voice cracking at the edges like she was holding back something enormous, pride, maybe, or the weight of understanding that her father's life had been saved by someone wearing the same rank her mother wore. The same rank that made the difference between heroes and stories people told in quiet rooms. The hospital administrator stepped to the center of the hallway. She held a folder that had been hand-delivered 1 hour earlier by a woman in a Navy suit who didn't ask permission to enter the building and wasn't asked to wait. The folder's edges were still marked with red classified stamps, the kind that meant the contents existed in spaces regular people didn't have clearance to access. She opened it with ceremony, with the understanding that she was reading words that had been locked away, words that now belonged to the light. "Major Katie Rodriguez," she began, her voice steady but careful, like she was walking through a minefield. "Silver Star for Valor under fire during Operation Kanjar, Sanjin Valley, 2011. The SEAL team leader nodded once. Acknowledgement. Respect for what that medal meant, for what you had to survive to earn it. 2 bronze stars with Valor, the administrator continued. 1 for medical innovation under combat conditions. 1 for command decisions that resulted in the survival of an entire patrol base during a coordinated attack. Another pause. The team leader's jaw tightened. He remembered. They all did. Purple Heart. The administrator looked up from the paper. Twice. First from an IED in Helmand province. Second from the mortar attack yesterday at this facility. She let that land. Let everyone understand that Katie's blood on the floor wasn't a civilian injury. It was a military casualty inflicted on hospital grounds, which meant it triggered protocols, investigations, legal jurisdictions that had nothing to do with Dr. Ashford's board connections. The SEAL team leader moved forward, and his voice carried the precise clarity of someone giving a mission briefing in a space where every word mattered. Major Rodriguez was ordered into deep cover following a Black Ops disaster in Sanjin that made her a target, he said. Official military records were scrubbed. Her identity was erased. Not as punishment. As protection. She was a ghost because we needed her alive. He paused. After 8 years of civilian work, she became a ghost again. A nurse at Oak Creek Memorial. Teaching medicine to people who had no idea they were learning from a decorated combat operator. At the back of the hallway, Dr. Ashford's face had gone from red to white to a color that didn't have a name. His hands moved first, his instincts screaming at him to run. He turned toward the security office at the end of the corridor, his mind already calculating the distance, the cameras, the footage of his medication error with Commander Hewitt 2 weeks ago, the dosing that would have been fatal if Katie hadn't stopped him. If he could delete it, if he could just get to those files in the next 45 seconds, her testimony would be hearsay, her firing would stand, the Navy's questions would have no evidentiary foundation. He made it 7 steps. The IT director stepped out of the security office before Ashford could reach it, a stocky man with a Marine Corps veteran cap sitting on the desk behind him, his arms crossed in a way that suggested he'd been waiting. Waiting specifically for this moment. Waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned patience in places Ashford couldn't imagine. Looking for something, Doctor. The IT director's voice was quiet. Not threatening. Just factual. Ashford's prepared excuse died on his lips. The IT director stepped aside and gestured toward his monitor. Every frame was there. The hallway camera from 2 weeks ago. Katie's precise intervention. Ashford's hand holding the syringe with a contraindicated combination that would have stopped a SEAL's heart in under 90 seconds. Every moment. Every damning second. I'm a Marine, the IT director said. When I saw you sedate that SEAL with a combo that violates basic protocol, I saved everything. He pulled up another file. When I saw you write her up for stopping you from killing him, I sent it to the state medical board with a full incident report. Timestamps. Dosage logs. Your electronic signature on orders that violate procedure. He turned to face Ashford directly. I also sent copies to Naval Intelligence's legal team. They're very interested in your interference with a military police investigation. How you had her escorted out before she could be interviewed. How you filed termination paperwork to eliminate a witness. Ashford tried to move past him, but 2 hospital security officers, both veterans, shifted into the hallway, blocking the exit. Their presence said everything. Ashford's call started bouncing that afternoon. The board members who'd promised him loyalty suddenly couldn't be reached. By 1500 hours, the hospital board was requesting his resignation effective immediately. His medical license was being flagged for investigation. His colleagues were returning his emails with single-word responses or no response at all. Nobody wanted proximity to the man who'd tried to destroy a decorated combat veteran. Nobody wanted to be associated with his name. He entered his office in silence that evening, the same silence he'd forced on countless nurses over the years. His hands shook as he packed framed credentials from Georgetown and Johns Hopkins, credentials that suddenly meant nothing against the weight of 2 classified files and 1 Marine who knew how to keep records. 6 months passed like a door closing. Katie Rodriguez stood in her new office at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in San Diego, the official designation reading Civilian Contractor, Combat Medicine Instruction. Her desk held credentials now, but different ones. Credentials that meant she could teach future generations of operators the difference between field expedient and field stupid, the difference between saving a life and losing it to the tremor in your hands. Through her window, she watched a training scenario playing out on the compound grounds, simulated mass casualty, simulated chaos, trainee medics working through the decision tree she'd taught them that morning. On the hook beside her desk hung a jacket. It was old, faded at the elbows, the kind of garment that looked like it had survived things. Inside the lining, barely visible unless you knew where to look, sat a unit patch. A faded symbol from a time and place that officially never happened, from a team that officially never existed. The patch had been sewn into that lining by careful hands 15 years ago, had stayed hidden against her heart through 8 years of military ops, through 2 wars, through civilian life, through the humiliation of being called just a nurse. It was still there. Still hidden. Still held close. Commander Hewitt stopped by her office mid-afternoon with his daughter, both of them carrying coffee from the facility cafe. His daughter had healed differently than her father had, healed with the knowledge that her parent had been saved by someone extraordinary. Hewitt's eyes still held the weight of operations, but now they held something else too, the lightness that comes from understanding you'd been in the hands of a legend. "The team wanted me to thank you again, Major," he said. "They wanted you to know." "I know, Commander," Katie said. Her voice was different now. Not deferential. Not defensive. Just certain. "And I was just doing my job." His daughter stepped forward carefully, aware of the scars hidden under the fabric, and hugged her like you'd hold something precious that had already broken once. "Thank you," she whispered. Across Norfolk, Dr. Marcus Ashford sat at a folding table outside a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a vape shop, business cards for supplemental insurance policies stacked in front of him. A veteran walked past, recognized him from the news coverage that had followed the Navy's statement about the incident at Oak Creek Memorial, and kept walking without breaking stride. Ashford's phone didn't ring. Hadn't rung in weeks. The silence was its own form of communication. That evening, Katie ran a training scenario, simulated mortar attack, mass casualties, chaos on a scale designed to break decision-making. A young corpsman froze, overwhelmed, his hands moving but his mind locked in paralysis. Katie's voice cut through the simulation like a knife through water, calm and certain and precise. "Breathe. Prioritize. Move." The same word someone had said to her in Sanjin when the world was burning and she had to choose between her own fear and her team's survival. The same words that had saved her life and shaped everything that came after. The corpsman steadied. Focused. Saved the dummy patient. Saved the training scenario. Learned that composure was a tactical skill, not a personality trait. After the debrief, Katie walked to her car with her shadow stretching long in the setting sun. Her hand touched the scars on her shoulder through her shirt, the physical reminder that invisibility had a cost. That being seen had a cost. That hiding who you were and being forced to reveal it both carried weights that never fully lifted. She drove past Oak Creek Memorial without slowing down, its windows reflecting the setting sun, its corridors no longer holding her name or her secrets. The price of heroism wasn't paid in medals. It was paid in the moments nobody witnessed, in the steadiness of hands nobody credited, in the silence of a nurse who'd learned how to survive by learning how to be forgotten. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and forced to prove who you really are, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to know they're braver than they believe. And in the comments below, tell me, have you ever had a moment where your true strength had to be revealed? I'd love to hear your story.